Okay, hey everyone. Now, I want to remind you all that this is not my fault that we're 13 minutes late. Okay? Now, whose fault is it? I don't really have a specific person I can blame this time, unfortunately. I'm going to blame 21st Reaction because he was just here. Like, literally, he was just here. The people on the panel can swear about this. And then he decided to leave. So, I mean, does that have anything to do with the stream being late? Not really, but, like, I have something to blame him for. So I'm going to blame him for multiple things. So today the discussion is Jesus based in reality. Now that's what we're going to be talking about. Sort of historical evidence for Jesus, and that type of stuff. My sort of I'm sort of expecting that Allan Ruhl here and Computing the Soul will be doing most of the heavy lifting, hopefully. But we'll see how this pans out. And of course, Lambuda here will be our Buddhist perspective on this topic.
Thanks for having me, Setubla.
But yeah, so okay, so that's basically where we're at with all this. So who wants to say something? Okay, no one.
It's kind of like being at the school dance. It's kind of like being at the school dance, you know. We're kind of like looking at each other, like who's going to make the first move.
John and I are being very polite because normally we jump in at any opportunity, but
I guess maybe I could kick things off by asking the first question. Al, what are the chances that Jesus didn't exist, like, at all? Like, can you address like that whole Jesus mythicism? He doesn't exist. Malarkey.
Well, there's two. Like, okay, are you talking about atheists like Bart Ehrman, or are you talking about like mythicists like Richard Carrier?
Let's go with Richard Carrier, Bob Price kind of mythicists.
Oh,
I know.
We have to. Okay, all right. So,
you know, on this topic, what I often hear from atheists is, yes, it's true that there isn't a single person with a PhD teaching at a university that believes in Jesus mythicism, but that's just because of the great cabal of Christians who are preventing atheists from teaching this.
Well,
because as we know, Christians run all the universities.
Of course.
Yeah, exactly. Like the standard academic has a view probably similar to Bart Ehrman, who does believe Jesus existed, or only slightly above that. Now, they may be a quote-unquote believer, like, you know, they might go to church. They may even be a priest, like the apostate, not officially an apostate, but he may as well have been an apostate, Raymond Brown, who basically is the big name in terms of Catholic quote-unquote scholarship. I call them fake scholars. And Lamb Protestant, I know you're not Catholic, but I know you have names just as bad as that, E.P. Sanders and filth like that. So to address that, you basically have to say, okay, first of all, make them know that they're in the minority. Now, that's not evidence, but it's no. There are people that hate Christianity. People like Bart Ehrman, who I'm going to be quoting here. I've got about 12 of Ehrman's books. He's a bit of a weasel, but at least he's consistent weasel. And basically, I just let them hang themselves. To quote, I think it was Napoleon who said, never interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake. I think that was Napoleon. I could be wrong, though. But yeah, so the key is just to keep asking questions, keep asking them for primary sources. And at the end of the day, and then ask them about other historical works. At this point, it's good to know about other ancient history apart from Christ. Because these people who promote this nonsense on these websites online, they've never studied any type of history. They've never read Tacitus, Josephus, Suetonius, Livy, you name it, they haven't read it. So essentially, my approach at this point is to use some presuppositional apologetics and just keep asking their questions and eventually get them to hang themselves. So you can ask them about things like Caesar, ask them about like Augustus, Julius Caesar. It's kind of hard to do Julius Caesar because he wrote his own life. And he wrote a lot of books about the things he did. So his activities are fairly well documented. So that might be a bit harder. But essentially just keep asking them if they've read any other kind of history. And eventually they'll say no, and then start asking, okay, and then start asking for primary sources. And then Richard Carrier's blog will probably come up, and stuff like that. In other words, they have not done primary sources. And most of these parallels come after Jesus Christ. And most of them, when you ask them, it's like, oh, yeah, so-and-so died and was resurrected. So-and-so had a virgin birth. It's like a virgin birth, like a tree exploded and then they came out there. That's not really a virgin birth. There's zero parallels of this stuff. At least I can't find any. And like, this is really the low-hanging fruit. I think this apologetic is on the way out. It's kind of kept alive by the internet and like things like the Zeitgeist movie and all that idiocy. And so those are just some opening thoughts. Does anyone want to say anything?
I've got a couple of things to ask. Actually, I was going to contribute one thing, and I was going to ask you a question because I've actually heard something kind of related to this that you might be able to answer. This is something a lot more fundamental about not Ehrman, Carrier's approach specifically. And this is the only thing I really know about Jesus mythicism per se. The thing that really bugs me about Richard Carrier is his insistence on using Bayes' theorem. Now, for those who don't know, this is a method of processing probabilities in order to come to combine probabilities of certain events. As somebody who is involved with artificial intelligence, I'm not a statistical or probabilistic person per se in a direct mathematical sense, but as somebody who has to use probabilities constantly and who is formally educated in such things, it really annoys me when I see people from the humanities or anywhere else, and this includes philosophy, by the way, when whether theists or atheists do it, when they try and use Bayes' theorem to argue philosophical or historical points, because you cannot quantify these things numerically, and Bayes' theorem depends on probabilistic numbers. So when I see Ehrman, for example, not Ehrman, I'm going to forever mix up Ehrman and Carrier. Carrier using Bayes' theorem to try and prove historical points, it's just laughable. And it's the same when people try and make philosophical points likewise. They're not very powerful arguments. So why you would found your entire historical presence on that, I don't understand. Edward Gibbon doesn't do this with history, although I don't think he's like someone who denies the existence of Christ as much as he denies Christianity's truth. None of these historians do that, but for some reason he decides to lend strength to his argument by using trying to quantify things that are non-numerical using a numerical method. It's madness to me. But the more important question, and this I think moves us up a little bit above the level of straight up Jesus mythicists, are these sorts of people who will claim that the Gospels aren't eyewitness accounts. And there's one person on YouTube whose specific YouTube channel is actually eluding me right now, but he points out, and he does use a primary source in this particular case, and I suspect you've probably heard this one before, Al, which is why I'm asking it. And he compares the Gospels, the four Gospels, to the works of a late Roman historian called Aminius Marcellinus, who wrote about, amongst other things, the Battle of Adrianople, where he was a soldier. And he says, well, there are a lot of details lacking in the Gospel accounts that we would expect to find in this sort of thing. Now, how he particularly deals with, for example, the Gospel of John, I'm not sure, but I was wondering, Al or anybody else, if they have any information on this sort of approach.
Well, I think at that point, you would simply have to ask the question, do all historians write identical, which they don't. Every historian's his own historian, right? You know, it's like, for example, and he also wrote at a different time. He wrote at the 4th century. He's got actually some good stuff covering the Arian crisis. I'm assuming we're talking about the same guy. I think the Battle of Adrianople was what, 378?
Something like that.
Yeah.
I think it was earlier than that. He was writing. He was born just after the Council of Nicaea and died like 20 years after Constantinople.
Yeah, and so like keep in mind, you probably, if you wanted to make a fair comparison, you probably wouldn't use him. You probably use, say, the works of Tacitus or someone who wrote shortly after the Gospels or shortly after the life of Christ or someone like that, as opposed to someone in the 4th century who has a lot more information of that to deal with. And besides, a battle is something where there's thousands of people. There's thousands of people in a battle on both sides. You can talk to all your friends afterwards and see what's going on. It's kind of like right now, I'm doing a lot of studying for the fall of Constantinople in 1453. I got my biography of Mehmet the Conqueror here, done by the 15th century Greek Christovoulos. So, and he, and so like when you go through all the primary sources, when the Turks breached the wall, we don't have any primary sources who wrote, or at least not many, because Francie's primary account, Francis, or I don't know how to pronounce his name, he talks about how he's not there. The emperor had him somewhere else in the city, and of course this guy was not there. So he, because he was on an island somewhere else in the Roman Empire, and so they all go there. And if you take a look at the battles, they're all a bit iffy on the details, but overall the general story is there. Did Giovanni Giustiniani Longo get hit in the leg or in the chest with an arrow? There's one account he got hit by a cannonball. So he got hit by a projectile. He later died of the wound, but it's contradictory accounts. So that's how a battle is. And keep in mind, in a battle, you're kind of in the heat of the moment. So you talk to people after. So you'd expect a lot more details in a battle, because what happens after a battle? You're talking with all your fellow soldiers who were in the battle and stuff like that. Does anyone want to add anything to that? Or
No, I think that was a really good response, actually.
Oh, thank you.
So one question to ask then, in terms of providing evidence for the reliability of the Gospels, why should we trust Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as reliable historical witnesses rather than, just some post first century documents, maybe as propaganda chosen by the church, something like that, something nefarious that a lot of doubters would like to paint the Gospels as?
Okay. No, that's good. And I'm going to say that right now. And John, while I'm giving the answer, I want you to have some scripture at the ready, because I'm going to ask you to quote scripture. So you've got the Gospels. If you ask someone like Bart Ehrman, when were the Gospels written? Yeah, you got the Gospel of Mark probably around the year 70. You got Matthew and Luke around the year 80. Gospel of John around the year 90. So 70 to 90, pretty much in the last third of the first century, when Christ lived in the first quarter of that century. And what I like to point out is when you take a look at the New Testament, there are 3 layers. This is something I've always said. There's 3 layers of information, 3 strata. The top layer is the furthest removed from Christ. That's the Gospels. If Christ leaves the scene at 30 AD, either he dies or he ascends to heaven, or as the Muslims say, escapes the cross and somehow goes up to heaven. No matter what happened, he leaves the scene 30 A.D. So the first gospel you don't get until 70 A.D. So that's 40 years. Plus you got the three gospels after that come later. So 40 years, not bad for ancient history, but we'd like better. Now, keep in mind, remember we have the Pauline epistle as well. Now, keep in mind, most critical historians, like people like Barter and who are skeptical like that, will only say St. Paul wrote 7 of his 13, 14, if you include Hebrews, epistles. You got Romans, Galatians, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Philippians, Philemon, 1 Thessalonians. You have these epistles. They're written 50 to 60 by St. Paul. St. Paul was an educated person. He knew how to write. So we're closer. We're closer to the cross than we were, but we're still probably around 20 years away, around 20, 25 years away. John, pop open your scripture. I want you to read for me 1 Corinthians 11, 23 through 26.
Sorry, 1 Corinthians, and the verses were
1 Corinthians 11, verses 23 through 26.
There is no room for praise here. The tradition which I received from the Lord and handed on to you is that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was being betrayed, took bread and gave thanks and broke it and said, "Take, eat, this is my body given up for you. Do this for a commemoration of me." And so with the cup, when the supper ended, "This cup," he said, "is the New Testament in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it for a commemoration of me." So it is the Lord's death that you are heralding whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup until he comes. And therefore, if anyone eats this bread or drinks this cup of the Lord unworthily, he will be held to account for the Lord's body and blood.
Okay, he talks about receiving from the Lord. So if you want some more specific, go to chapter 15, read verses 3 through 8.
The chief message I handed on to you, as it was handed on to me, was that Christ, as the scripture had foretold, died for our sins, that he was buried, and then, as the scriptures had foretold, rose again on the third day, that he was seen by Cephas, when by the 11 apostles, and afterwards by more than 500 of the brethren at once, most of whom are alive at this day, though some have gone to their rest. When he was seen by James, and then by all the apostles, and last of all, I too saw him, like the last child that comes to birth unexpectedly.
What translation are you reading?
The Knox. It was the closest one.
Okay, I'm going to read that because I don't like the way it did verse 3. But I'll just read verse 3. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. Now, he talks about receiving, but he doesn't say it's from Christ. So it's not a revelation from Christ, and he would have said that. So where do you think St. Paul got this information?
Probably from the other apostles.
When?
Before, not sure.
Okay, so we have St. Paul. Okay, the events of the cross are approximately 30 AD, right?
Mm-hmm.
And St. Paul's conversion, what was 1 or 2 years after that, maybe? 6 months, 2 years. Let's go with 2 years. That's probably the safest assumption. So I'm just going to read here because I kind of don't like that Knox translation. So sorry.
It's fine.
Okay. Okay. this is St. Paul talking in verse 11. So Galatians 1, verse 11. For I would have you known, brethren, that the gospel which was preached to me is not man's gospel. For I did not receive it from man, nor was I. But when he who had sent me apart before I was born, this verse 15, and had called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his son to me in order that I might preach among the Gentiles. So God revealed the truth to St. Paul. He's writing this in the early 50s. I did not confer with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away into Arabia, and again I returned to Damascus. Now, how long was that? He tells us in the next verse. Then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem. So 3 years. So we got 32 AD approximately. Add 3 years to that. It's 35 AD. I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas, that's Peter, and remained with him 15 days. He's very precise. He's given the specific days. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. In what I am writing to you before God, I do not lie. Then I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia. So he's preaching. And I was still not known by sight of the churches of Christ in Judea. Oh, I guess we lost John. Okay, so I guess continue. So at this point, he's more or less unknown to the Jerusalem church, save to Peter and James. Now, and then, okay, so we've already agreed that this is 35 AD. Now, look, if you're a new convert and you get a chance to meet the disciples of Christ, Peter and James, what are you going to talk about? If you have 15 days, you're going to talk about the faith, right? I mean, heck, if I had 15 days with Peter and James, that's all I would talk about, how things were with Christ and stuff. So his theology, Paul's, comes straight from Peter and James. And where does Peter and James get it? Well, from Christ itself. We're on top of the cross at this point. And then, we heard and I was still not known by sight to the churches of Christ in Judea. They only heard it said, he who once persecuted us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy. And they glorified God because of me. Now, that's the end of chapter 1. Let's start chapter 2. Because keep in mind, we're trying to build a time frame here.
Can I quickly just add something?
Yeah, sure.
That's important to keep in mind. St. Paul went from being, in this very short time span, a persecutor of the church to being just readily trusted by the apostles. Wouldn't it take something like really big in order to change somebody's mind about you? Like it's one thing to say, okay, we'll trust you tentatively, and another thing to say, here are the secrets of the faith. Here, just go wild.
Yeah, no, in fact, he talks about that in verse 23.
Mm-hmm.
He only heard it said, he who once persecuted us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy. So, yeah, no, that's true. That's very important to Paul's background and his conversion and why he's such a good witness. So chapter 2 says this. Keep in mind, we're at 35 AD, so we're starting to build a time frame. We've got the continuous from Peter and James from the life of Christ up until 32, 35. Their info is delivered to St. Paul. Now, what does St. Paul do? Then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. I went up by revelation, and I laid before them, but privately before those who were of repute, Peter, James, the gospel which I preached to the Gentiles, lest somehow I should be running or had run in vain. But even Titus, who was with me, was not compelled to be circumcised. Okay, essentially pause there. That's the first 3 verses are the most important there. So he goes up after 14 years. Let's do some math. 35 plus 14, we're at 49 AD. And he goes to confirm what he's been preaching. And they say, Paul, you're good. Keep doing it. They confirm his gospel. And it talks like he met with the people of repute after Peter, James, John, all the top dogs in the Jerusalem church. Calling the apostles top dogs, that's kind of weird. But and then he talked with the rest of the church. Now, so this is 49 AD. His epistles are written in the 50s. His first one is probably First Thessalonians. It's probably the first one. And then of course you got Philippians, 1 and 2 Corinthians, etc. All those 7 I gave. Of course, as Christians, we believe he wrote all 14 of his epistles, but for the more skeptical person, we'll be happy with the 7 epistles of Paul. So you have this is
but I suppose one thing to establish first is, how do we know any of these were written by Paul? Because okay, I understand like serious atheist historians would not question that at least the first 7 epistles were written by him. But I have interacted with many atheists online that say they was probably all just created around the 300s or something.
300s.
Yeah, I know 300? I know this is insane, but this is commonly
okay.
When I talk with atheists.
We have manuscript evidence of the Pauline epistles from the 200s, so that's more or less wrong. And then of course my question would be for them is, who wrote them and why? I mean, if you can't, we have like writings of church fathers quoting St. Paul. Like we have. And there's huge controversy in the early church. There's a historical criteria called the criteria of embarrassment. There were some fringe Christian groups in the early years that did not accept Paul, like the Ebionites. They didn't accept Paul's authority. So why would, if Paul's this fake guy, how come people would forge letters in his name to have an orthodox teaching from him? Do you see where I'm coming from?
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Yeah, so like at that point, these people have not studied the early church, I'm guessing. The most they got is like blog reading. Now, I'm not saying you don't have to deal with their arguments, because if something's out there, you gotta deal with it, right? But
yeah, I mean, I just mean in my personal experience, it's more often to get an atheist that thinks that the entire Bible is invented by Constantine than someone who's actually read even Bart Ehrman and knows those types of arguments.
Yeah, I don't even think Robert Price would say that, and he's probably the most skeptical of the skeptical. I don't even think Carrier would say that Constantine or someone else in the around 300 wrote the Bible. Like we have references of Christ way before that, and it's so unbelievable that someone came in, corrupted all the manuscripts, corrupted all the church fathers. Because keep in mind, we got their writing too. We got Syriac fathers like Saint Ephraim, who was, I guess, around that time. But you got earlier, and see, the thing is, if you're going to invent a faith around 300 AD or so, why would you make it as ugly? Like there's a lot of internal conflicts. Like as John and I have dealt with in our debates on the papacy, we've always dealt with the whole Saint Stephen versus Saint Cyprian issue on the baptizing of lapsed, right? Are sacraments outside the church valid, right? That's something that we've held. And of course, Stephen was using papal authority, but that papal authority was being opposed. I'm not going to go into all the details, but I mean, why would you invent a whole bunch of ugly episodes like that? And I could name half a dozen more off the top of my head, and there's more than that. If you're trying to just invent a new faith.
And on top of that, why would you create a savior from the backwaters of Judea? Like you already had myths that really encapsulated the greatness of Rome. Think of Romulus and Remus. Like that is a true founding of a great city narrative. Like you could just adapt something like that. You don't need to just attribute something to a bunch of religious zealots over in rebellious territory. Usually the excuse given, well, it was a way of integrating the Jews. But like you don't need to integrate the Jews. Just force them to convert at point, or exile them from the country, or whatever. But you don't really need to do that.
And
I mean, like, that's a good point, actually. You see, maybe 100 years later, you could have written a very interesting, very nice, apocryphal, mythologized story of someone like Simon Bar Kokhba, and he would have had an immediate appeal not only to the Jews, but also to the Gentiles, right? You know, big military man takes over Judea, throws out the Romans, you know, he does some crazy things according to the rabbis, but you could very easily mythologize such a figure into, you could say, well, you know, he ascended into heaven. Why not pick him? Someone who was able to motivate an army of something like 100,000 people.
yeah, no, that's yeah.
I was going to say, in talking to random people about the question of how believable the Bible is, the distance between their perception and actual serious historians about where the problems are is so far. I mean, Dan Brown is probably seen as more of an authority than any actual, you know, so have you found there's a way to get through to normal people, just like an idea or a fact that will shock them into realizing quite how extensive our manuscript evidence is and how early, you know, the witnesses are, and you know, how do you bridge somebody from this kind of crazy level of skepticism towards the subtleties and nuances that the more informed, you know, historical critics come up with?
Is it really a lack of manuscripts and historical records that's their skepticism is coming from?
Right, they're probably not motivated to believe. That's a good point.
Well,
it's just we have to remember. I know it sounds very harsh and everything, but we just have to remember, including for every one of us and everybody in the chat, is that, you know, 95% of the time people believe things based on some kind of desire, and sometimes that desire is good, sometimes that desire is bad. So you know, there's you know, it's no surprise that there's so many passages about hardness of heart in the Bible. Oh, Pharaoh had a hardness of heart. All these people that sin have hardness of heart because, you know, their minds are shut. So, but you can show them the Greek manuscript if you want. You could try. But I just wanted to put that little sad note in there.
I guess it's just a whole series of objections that they've come across. But I think you're right that when people do research, they come to believe more and more, but they're never going to make the final leap to take Jesus as their savior unless it's a decision. Even if there's overwhelming evidence, people will ever concoct more and more excuses, right?
Yeah, remember that there's a conversion of the intellect with, you know, with some autists that works, right? But the conversion of the intellect, but there's also a conversion of the will that has to happen at some point, usually after that.
So I do want to ask Allan a question, and just to elaborate on a specific theme. So we were asking about the 7 epistles that are generally accepted by everyone as being Pauline. What criteria do we use to say that those are definitely written by Paul? And there are some scriptures that I'd say I couldn't defend Paul as the author. I'd have to say on faith that Paul is the writer, maybe through a scribe. And I'm perfectly fine with saying that. Scribes are something that the church had, and that's perfectly fine by me. But so, for example, I don't think I could defend Hebrews as being something written by Paul, even though I do think it was most likely written through him. But the 7 that are attributed to Paul, what basis do we have to attribute those ones to him?
Well, there's a tad problem with that because, first of all, I'm an Orthodox believer. I believe he wrote all 14. And the criteria that people like Bart Ehrman used to say he wrote 7 contradicts my worldview. Because, for example, they'll say, now, first of all, at face value, if we find a letter from the ancient world or a document from the ancient world or the medieval world or modern world, and it's got a name on it, we should probably assume it's written by that person. Oh, sorry. I apologize. Unless proved otherwise. Unless proved otherwise. So, according to people like Ehrman, they found ways to debunk. It started with the pastoral epistles, and then it got to Ephesians and Colossians and Second Thessalonians, because they say like the theology of like say Second Thessalonians contradicts the theology of First Corinthians. So what are you going to do there? And basically they've said that Jesus, the historical Jesus, historical meaning based on higher criticism, is like a 19 like kind of an apocalyptic prophet who proclaimed the end of the world, that the kingdom of God was going to come down and land on earth there, and he would rule, and the last would be first and the first would be last, and all that stuff. And that's what they did. And so St. Paul is taking that theology when he talks about like the end times and Christ coming in judgment. And so they take that theology and they can interpret those 7 in a way consistent with that theology, but they can't do it with those 6 other epistles. So therefore they're going to be like, well, that does not fit in with Paul's theology. But keep in mind, they're incorrectly interpreting Paul's theology. So that's why they only think those are written. Of course, we as Scripture, as Orthodox believers, small o Orthodox, we don't believe the Scripture contradicts each other. So it doesn't matter if it's First or Second Timothy or Romans; they all mesh perfectly together. So I do understand your question, John, but I think it's coming from the wrong place. They're not saying that as a good thing. There's 7 defenses. They're saying that as a bad thing. Like, oh, he only wrote that. Now, those, why do they think they wrote those also? I mean, it's a bit convenient for those, because in most of those, Paul talks about his life. In First Thessalonians, he's mentioning the contemporary situation with the church in Judea. He talks about his own life in First Corinthians. He talks about receiving them, and that's something I also wanted to wrap up. I wanted to wrap up my 3 layers talk, but does that help clarify them, John?
It does, but could I just make one clarification on my end? I want to distinguish knowing from showing. So I would say I know and affirm that all 14 are written by Paul. I'm not going to say I can show that or prove or demonstrate that to any skeptic. I think you're probably in a much better place to do that than I am. My only point is I would just come from a place of just cutting the loss and saying, okay, fine, Paul only wrote 7, but that's all I really need. So thank you for granting me that. So I do want to make that bit of clarification. The second thing is, do we only need those 7, or is it better that we actually have arguments to affirm that no, it's not just 7, it's the whole 14?
Well, see, the thing is, a lot of these skeptical skeptical people like Bart Ehrman will grant you those 7. They'll grant, like if you're debating Bart Ehrman on historical Jesus or historical Paul or the early church, he will grant you those 7. So you can interpret those, and he can't throw them out. If you try quoting the parable of the lost sheep or something, you'll just get thrown out by Bart Ehrman. So I mean, yes, we can try to give arguments for the Pauline authorship of Colossians and the pastorals and all that stuff. But I mean, if we take those 7, we can prove that the message, the death, the resurrection, and the deity of Christ was the Christian message from the beginning. And on top of that, the Lord's Supper, as we have read in 1 Corinthians 11. So so it's the fact that they'll grant you that much is enough to work with, in my opinion. and then you can show what the Christian message was from the earliest times, from the early 30s.
Mm-hmm. And just to touch on one other thing, some more moderate Christians, such as Mark Goodacre, he'd be an example of this. He'd say that they weren't written by Paul, but they can still be given Pauline authorship because the idea of authorship in the ancient world had a much more expansive definition. So, for example, if one of Paul's disciples wrote one of those epistles and they attributed it to Paul, in the ancient context, that would not be considered to go against the notion of authorship, because the idea of authorship and attributing your work to a master, someone you apprentice, that was considered to be a rightful recognition, and one could do this. What do you think of those kinds of approaches? Just re-examining and expanding on the definition of authorship to include somebody like Paul.
I mean, I would like to see the evidence for that claim.
Okay.
Because I do got to admit, I think Bart Ehrman has debunked that, because he's looked into that, because that was often used, and apparently it was only used in some schools, I think around the time of Plato.
The Pythagorean school is the example Mark Goodacre gives.
Okay, I have to check that out. But I think he's making a mistake. He's Mark Goodacre. I don't know a lot about him. I've heard his name, obviously, but it's not like I have a corpus of his works or anything. He's trying to appeal to the academy, appeal to this ultra skeptical point of view. So he grants their presuppositions, and he's like, "But do this." And still, they're more inclined to call them forgeries, because there's a whole theology argument. The theology of the pastorals is inconsistent with what you have in 1 Corinthians. Like for example, I'll tell you something. In the pastorals, it's, you hear a lot about the bishop, the deacons, etc. Something that Bart Ehrman will say to you is like, "Oh, where is that in 1 Corinthians? He's talking to the church in Corinth. You see bishops and deacons running around? No, it's like a mess." But it took a few decades until you got this sophisticated theology. Of course, he's reading that into it. Now, but yeah, so that's what they say. So a noble approach by Mark Goodacre, but I don't think I'd go there personally. But mind you, it's something I'd like to read up on more.
Also, aren't deacons actually explicitly mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles as well? And that records a time that's much earlier on, right? So I don't know how he could do that, unless he would claim that the Acts of the Apostles were written later.
Well, what someone like Ehrman will just say is like, "Oh yeah, that was written in 90 AD when they already had deacons, so they're injecting them back into the story."
Right. So then why don't they record the martyrs? So why don't they record the martyrdom of Peter and Paul then?
Yeah, I know.
You think you'd mention that?
Yeah, it makes no sense. But I'm just telling you what they say. I know it's total nonsense, but I'm just telling you what they say. So
yeah, and also this is kind of related to that as well. How do they reconcile the belief that Jesus was some sort of apocalyptic preacher with the Old Testament, right? Because you have, say, in Deuteronomy 18:18, I think it's Jeremiah 31, in Isaiah chapter 51. You have all of these talks about a new law coming forth and a prophet like Moses, and they've already seen, even if we take like a later date for the Exodus, right? You've had the Mosaic law persisting for 1,200 years. Why would it be that some apocalyptic preacher who strangely fulfills all of the prophecies around this new Moses, why would it be that they would be expecting, say, an imminent end of the world? How do they justify this?
Well, I mean, I don't think they've ever been like, to be honest, I don't think they've thought as deep as you have about this. And that's just a simple question you're giving, and that's good. But of course, they think that from a purely naturalistic point of view, that, oh, he didn't fulfill any prophecies. The later writers of the New Testament are just trying to shoehorn that into them. Because, like, I think I heard Ehrman once say that, I mean, after the death of Jesus, they were confused, and so they went back to their scriptures to try to make sense of it. And they took a look at certain verses in Isaiah, certain verses in the Psalms, and tried to apply it to Jesus. And like, oh, he was vindicated, and he was which was eventually interpreted to be resurrection, and he's going to come back and complete the job. That's what they'll say.
Yeah, but then they put really weird words in Jesus's mouth all of the time. Doesn't it seem a little bit kind of contrary to the Torah that they were raised on their entire lives?
What words are you talking about?
So, for example, right, you have Jesus continually quoting different prophecies. The one that I've got in mind at the moment is when Jesus is carrying the cross. I believe it's in Luke. And he quotes Hosea chapter 10, mountains cover us, hills bury us, or whatever variation it is, right? It seems to me that if you were placing words retroactively in somebody's mouth, in your documents, you would be lying you would be bearing false witness to an extreme extent. You would be essentially inventing the fulfillment of all prophecy. Doesn't that seem like contrary to the extremely scrupulous way that the Torah was maintained around the time when, say, Peter and John were born?
Well, I think this actually has to do like what it means to fulfill a prophecy. Like I did a video on my channel not that long ago with John, and we talked about the virgin birth. And if John wants to say something, how they viewed prophecy back then versus how we view it now. Like they viewed prophecies in other ways. He talks about Flavius Josephus. So you have a guy like Rabbi Tovia Singer saying, oh, the prophets say this, Christ didn't do it. But that just to keep in mind, we're talking about the 21st century mindset, and we're talking about ancient Israelites, how they viewed scripture. We don't have a lot of sources. We got some, but not as many as we want. And it's something I talked about with John, if John wants to say a bit more about that.
Yeah, in this specific example, we cited dual prophecies. So, for example, I believe it was in Daniel where Josephus says, yeah, here are the two horns. The first horn is fulfilled in this historic event, but the second horn is fulfilled now with the Roman Empire. In a similar way, one interpretation for the book of Isaiah that I offered was maybe it's also a dual prophecy. Maybe there's the event that happens in the present as a sign for King Ahaz to note that God is on his side when he triumphs over the foreign kings. And there's the miraculous nature of the prophecy, which is fulfilled in Christ, which is the second half of the prophecy. And that prophecy is fulfilled in Christ the Messiah to the house of David as a whole. So that's the sign given to the house, which is more miraculous in nature, because the prophecy itself is spoken of as being as high as heaven and as low as Sheol or death. And of course, a regular virgin giving a birth from his court is probably not going to be that miraculous sign or that miraculous dimension to the prophecy. That would have to be fulfilled in the future. And of course, that also meshes well. I didn't mention it in the video, but it also meshes well in two later chapters of Isaiah when it speaks of the Messiah being a wonderful chancellor, being God, etc., etc. So that was one way of fulfilling a prophecy that's not understood in our conventional sense, where one person makes a prediction and then it all gets fulfilled all at once. That doesn't always happen in Scripture. Sometimes you have a dual fulfillment. Sometimes you have a fulfillment where there is a motif that's fulfilled again or twice over later on in history. And those are more topological. So yeah, there are plenty of ways to understand prophecy, more than just, oh, this is what he said would happen, and it comes to pass. That's there. It's a kind of prophecy in scripture, but it's not the only way.
Yeah, but I didn't mean like that necessarily. What I'm saying is that you've got Jesus saying these things, and they're saying things that it would seem Ehrman is claiming that they invented after the fact, and that seems to cause a real moral conflict.
Oh, I see. So one thing to keep in mind is, would these prophecies have made more sense if the authors were trying to phone it in? So, for example, Jesus makes prophecies about the destruction of the temple. If these gospels were written after the fact, then one would think, oh, this is the kind of thing they would want to phone in, say, he got it right. See, but the temple was destroyed, just like we said. They don't do anything of the sort. They just mention it in passing, and it's up to the Christians afterwards to connect those dots.
Well, yeah, and then you've got the whole problem. Like, I think it's meant. I know it's mentioned in Matthew. I think it's mentioned in Luke as well. Like, you've got the whole problem of Acts necessarily coming after Luke, and then Acts not mentioning stuff that happened in the 60s AD, and then you see the whole thing falls apart.
Mm-hmm. I'm actually kind of curious. So the contention is because Acts doesn't mention the destruction of the temple either, therefore Acts should be in dispute too, or
No. What I'm saying is that Acts doesn't mention the martyrdom of Peter and Paul, right? Which many people mean. Well, to many people, I think it was Jimmy Akin has said this, and a bunch of other people said it. You know, it effectively hard limits Acts to about 62 AD.
Oh, I
right.
see.
Now, obviously, the critical historians or critical scholars, I won't call them historians, they can say whatever, right? But because Acts, by this very fact that it just sort of ends without going on to what happens to Paul and Peter, right? Just sort of ends. And Luke is before that, and Luke, if I recall correctly, mentions Jesus' prophecy about the destruction of the temple. It kind of creates a little bit of a kind of problem, you know, with this whole attitude of like he couldn't have possibly predicted the destruction of the temple kind of thing, doesn't it? You see the problem?
Yeah, a few things to keep in mind here. One, Luke is borrowing heavily from Matthew and from Mark, as I would see it. So he is also carrying over other sources too, and it's those earlier gospels at the very least that should at least drive a bit of a wedge between themselves and Luke later on. He could just be following it in what the synoptics are saying, rather than trying to point to or away from a future event.
Yeah, the problem is that makes it even worse.
Yeah, I guess I'm a little stumped on this one. Al, would you like to address it?
Well, are you? I'm trying to see the thrust of your argument here. It's true that Acts does not mention the destruction of the temple or the martyrdom of.
I can clarify if you'd like.
Sure.
I can clarify if you'd like. Okay, so my argument isn't that Acts doesn't contain the destruction of the temple. We know that, right? What I'm saying is that it doesn't mention the martyrdom of St. Peter and St. Paul. We know, based on the blurb at the beginning, that it comes chronologically after Luke, because, you know, in my work, Theophilus, blah, 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 right? So we know that Luke is written prior to Acts. Now, if memory serves me, Luke writes in the Gospel of Luke that there is this prediction of the temple being destroyed. And as John has pointed out, he's working off of Mark and Matthew, whichever one has priority, right? So then it necessarily follows that because Luke is earlier than Acts, and Luke is depending on Mark and Matthew presumably for this prophecy, as well as the other things where it quotes effectively verbatim, that just makes it worse. That means that having Jesus's prediction that the destruction of the temple, we'd have it earlier on. So this just makes the critical position even less feasible.
Yeah, I know. In fact, I think there's a good way, like first example, at the very beginning, I talked about like the third layer of of evidence in the New Testament, the Gospels. Keep in mind, I said, I think I said, if I didn't say it, I meant to say it. They will say that the Gospels are written 70 to 90. That's what they say. That's what Bart Ehrman says. That's what Raymond Brown says. That's what you'll learn if you do that. And yes, you're right. There's a lot of inconsistencies here. And the whole reason they date them late. Like, for example, if you see the Gospel of Mark, they'll say Mark's the earliest. They'll say it was written from 66 to 75. Why 66? Why not just go for 65? Just a nice round number, 10 years. Because the war starts in 66. That's why. And once the war started, the temple was in danger, so it was safe to make that prediction. Because there's a good chance the temple would get destroyed. And of course, after 70 AD, when the temple was destroyed, it's easy to do that. So they're saying, because these people have a historical method that does not allow predictive prophecy. And so that's why they have to push the Gospels back, because those words appear in the Gospels predicting the destruction of the temple. Therefore, they have to do that back. But you are absolutely right, Soul, that you can certainly use those inconsistencies to make a good case. But the thing where you can't get by these people is they made the presupposition that there's no predictive prophecy. So therefore, it can't be. It has to be after 70, certainly pre-66, once the war breaks out. So yeah, I think you brought up some good points.
Yeah, this is an incredibly important point to sort of belabor. Is that the dating of the Gospels is purely based on the assumption that Christ could have not correctly predicted the destruction of the temple. But I mean, even if you want to have a sort of like atheistic assumption of the dating, that's still really unwarranted. Because it's not like the temple being destroyed is some crazy event that couldn't have been falsely predicted. The temple had been destroyed before. Even if you want to assume the Gospels are false, it's still an unwarranted prediction to use that to be how you date it.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean,
it's like, sorry, I know in John he explicitly makes these like clarifications of things that happened in the past, such as Peter's death. So if the Gospel of John is considered last in the timeline, and it's making these specific notations to events that happened in the past, like the lack of those notations in the other Gospels would suggest that it didn't happen yet. Like if we're assuming a kind of like literary tradition.
Oh, you asking me? Oh, so just for clarification, by John, do you talk about? Are you specifically talking about getting like thrown out of the synagogues?
That too, but I was thinking specifically how John clarifies when, like, when Jesus says that Peter will have his arms stretched out, and then John says because this is the way he died. So it would be an event that happened already.
What verse are you talking about?
Let me look it up real quick.
Do you want to say something in the meantime, John?
No. Well, let's see. Would you mind if I asked a question that might be a little off topic? No, not too much. Like it's still on the subject of Jesus and history.
Yeah.
I did find the verse if you want.
Okay, go for it.
Yeah.
Sorry. So John 21 verses 18 and 19, it goes, Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I tell you, when you were young, you dressed yourselves and walked where you wanted, but when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you to where you do not want to go." And then verse 19 says, Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death which Peter would glorify God. And after he had said this, he told him, "Follow me." So John is specifically saying, the way in which Peter would be crucified. And so we can tell that this is a later gospel because it's the martyrs have already started piling up. And if this is something that John, John's typically just viewed as the last of the timeline because it makes these historical notations. Like why didn't Luke, the actual historian, make these notations like John did?
Luther, this is a really thing that you probably wouldn't have known, but I've heard from, I think it was either one of the podcasts on Reason and Theology, or it's directly from Jimmy Akin. It turns out that the description of Peter's martyrdom in the Greek is actually future tense.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and they corrected it based on the historical models they've got.
Luther,
Yeah.
just got a question for you. I'm going to ask the same question that I asked John a bit earlier. What translation are you reading?
Oh, I just picked any random one. I guess that was the NIV.
Okay, I thought it was NIV because Peter's name does not appear there in the translation I have, and the New International Version has the knack of if a name is not mentioned in a while, they throw it in there instead of the pronoun. They do that in a few places. It's not just there, but New International Version has a knack of doing that. That's why I really don't like NIV. Sure, it was the first Bible I owned, but
good point.
Nearly an errant version. It's the nearly an errant version.
Yeah, I know. I'll still leave my point with bated breath about like, why would John make these historical notes? He's just like an old guy when he's writing, whereas Luke, the actual historian who is like commissioned by the apostles to write this stuff, never made any of these historical notes, suggesting it would be an earlier writing text.
Well, I think you're actually reading more into it than it is there. I think it's kind of actually vague because I think he's kind of like being metaphorical there, meaning you'll be put to death, because it's kind of vague in its description. Stretch out your hands, and then another will gird you and carry to where you wish you don't want to go. So I think essentially Christ is just telling them persecution's coming. I don't think it's as detailed as you think it is. I mean, possibly you should try to check some more translations. I'm talking all of us here, and possibly check the Greek on that, what verbs they use. But I think it's kind of vague. It's basically a description saying trouble is coming. And of course, Christ talks about being divided against our family and stuff like that. And so, like, eventually we know it's going to become big. He talks about this message being preached to the end of the ends of the earth. And I mean, obviously you're going to run into problems with secular authorities. Like, most obvious is the Roman Empire, obviously. And we know that they certainly had their way with a lot of early Christians.
Yeah, I guess I'll maybe I did super chat earlier, but if you want to take this, I don't know if John wants to.
I'll put the super chat on the screen now.
Yeah. I don't know if John wants to ask his question first, but it was just a vague, because like we in the West often rely on the Greek texts, but there's like, a whole family of texts in the Eastern side with the more Aramaic way. Some of these documents date to like 2nd century or so they're a tad earlier than some of ours. Still not within like the 1st century, but like like the Diatessaron or the Peshitta, these are like Aramaic texts that are sometimes sourced in the East. They seem to date to around like 160 to 250 or something like that. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on like their reliability or anything, because it's still hotly debated.
Now, John, you want to say anything about that?
No, I really don't have too much of an opinion on which manuscript tradition we use. I personally just trust whatever New Testament scholars use, because like the language background is not something I have a deep interest in, nor is it something I've looked extensively at. I personally even just prefer the Latin manuscript tradition found through the Vulgate, because theologically I trust the church, so I go there. But I really couldn't comment on anything serious with regards to the Aramaic source texts. I think Allan would probably be much better.
Unfortunately, I'm not much better. Like me, I'm big on the Greek and Latin tradition as well. And like, it's a shame because if you listen to the recent episode on reason and theology with where Timothy Flanders talked a lot about like the church history stuff. This was about 2 weeks ago. He said that Flanders said that there's a lot to be done, unlike the early Syriac church. It's kind of ignored. They focus on the Greek and the Latin because there's the PL, PG, Latin, Greek, then PO, Patrological Orientalist, something like that, which is everything else, like Ethiopian, Syriac.
Oh, yeah, I know the one you're talking about, Patrologia Orientalis.
Yeah, and like that's the one that's had the least scholarship done on it. So like I'm sure if you went to like a monastery in Iraq or Syria, or probably not the Holy Land, that's probably all Latin and Greek now, but a place where the Roman Empire didn't touch.
Well, I mean, Ephraim the Syrian was writing in Syriac, and he was in Nisibis and Edessa, which was under Roman rule.
Well, he's certainly the most well-known of the church fathers that are Syriac, and he's 4th century. But can you name one as popular prior to Nicaea?
I mean, the one that pops into my head is not Jacob of Sarug, the bishop who Ephraim was under. I think it was like St. James or something of Nisibis, but he wasn't as popular.
Yeah, and like I don't know like if there's available translated Syriac documents pre-Nicaea. Like of course you got Saint Ephraim, he's famous, but I don't know of any others. Like I don't know if like popular or academic.
Well, I mean, you could look in unorthodox places. I mean, I think Tatian was a Syriac, but he was a Gnostic, right? So I don't know if he was writing in Greek or Syriac, but there's a chance he would have been writing in Syriac at the very least.
I got to confess, I've not read his writings.
Basically, he wrote like a kind of a paraphrase and a kind of a reconciliation of the Gospels called the Diatessaron. Luther mentioned.
Yeah, that's what I was mentioning. Where they're not in the East, it's not really an origin of like the Gospels. They would kind of rewrite the Gospels as single texts rather than having 4. They were like synoptics, and so it's inherently edited because it's been revised to be simpler and straightforward. But at the same time, they're doing this very early in time. Like these are like things that are done in like the 200s, the 3rd century and stuff like that. So they're doing it like kind of pre-Nicaea. And so it would suggest that there's obviously going to be an older text that they're taking it from that would give credit for it being so early. Like if you're writing a synoptic gospel in like 180, it implies that there's probably been a gospel tradition before then for a while.
Yeah, it turns out the Syriac version, it would seem, this is according to Wikipedia, so a great source. A number of recensions of the Diatessaron are extant. The earliest part of the Eastern family of recensions is preserved in the 4th century theologian Ephraim the Syrian's commentary on Tatian's work, which itself is preserved in 2 versions, an Armenian translation preserved in 2 copies, and a copy of Ephraim's original Syriac text dated to the late 5th or early 6th century, which has been edited by Louis Leloir, I think that's his name is. Yeah, so even when we get earlier stuff, at least in this case, we get it through Ephraim.
Is there a translation in English of it? Like you said a critical edition, but like a lot of time these critical editions are left in like collated, like their original language essentially.
There's been translations into Middle English, at the very least, Latin. I would be very surprised if there isn't an English translation. Here we go. Early Christian writings. Translated by Roberts and Donaldson. Right, yeah, you've got the Diatessaron here in just modern English.
Oh wow. Okay, I'll have to
I'll
look at
post
that.
it in the chat.
Yeah. No, that's because
Even
So,
sorry, go on.
Oh, I was just gonna ask, Alan, are you familiar with a bit of a dispute going on between a maximalist and minimalist facts approach to defending like the resurrection and the early events of the church?
I mean, I've heard about it. Like the minimal facts was kind of like for example, I at the beginning kind of used a modified version of that. That you can take if you just grant the certain key points in Christ's life. Like for example, like I'm not going to go through all the arguments now because that will take a while, and but I'm going to quote Bart Ehrman in this book, Jesus, Apocalyptic Prophet for the New Millennium. Now, keep in mind, this is an academic book published by Oxford University Press. He's more likely to tell the truth in these books than he is in Harper One, because he'll like spin the language to make it sound more skeptical, to sell more books. And so like these books more important than Harper One. Now, take a look what Bart Ehrman says about the whole story of Christ. What I think we can say, this on page 229, what I think we can say with some confidence is that Jesus actually did die. He probably was buried, and that some of the disciples, and then he, in brackets, all of them, some of them, question mark, close bracket, claimed to have seen him alive afterwards. Among those who made this claim, interesting enough, was Jesus' brother James, who came to believe, etc., etc. So he says he died. He was we can essentially say with confidence he died. He was buried, and his followers had experiences of him post-death. And of course, Bart Ehrman's an anti-supernaturalist. So basically, if you're a supernaturalist, all you need is one miracle to fill in the blank. We affirm the same things, just that our explanation is supernatural. We just throw in the one supernatural event, and that's God the Father raising Jesus from the dead. And so that's the minimal facts approach. Mm-hmm. I've not heard of what the maximum facts are.
So Linda McGrew, she is an apologist herself, a philosopher, also a homemaker, and mother. In essence, she's a very smart lady, and basically she kind of challenged this approach, the minimal facts use, and said, "Wait, why are we minimal facts using? Why not just like throw everything at them? Why are we giving up so much ground? Let's actually just prove all the things. Like let's actually try to show that the Gospels are usable, that we're not just relying on 7 letters from Paul, that these other Pauline letters can be very useful too. Let's actually try to give reasons why we should believe them and hold them to a higher standard, etc., etc." She thinks that basically the whole minimal facts approach can be us selling ourselves short, and that we should actually shore up the overall probability that this happened. The other approach is, of course, wait, no, why are we extending ourselves like that? We only need to take what we need. Like, let's not overshoot ourselves by arguing for anything more. So that's kind of the dispute there.
Well, that's interesting because, I mean, okay, no, that's true. Like, we could, but like, there's one, you've got the minimal facts, which they grant you. The facts they grant you. So if I'm debating Bart Ehrman, he will grant me those facts. I got the quote from him in that book, as you just heard, page 229. Or you could try to prove to him that everything in the gospel is reliable, but keep in mind, he's a radical skeptic. You're dealing with a radical skeptic there. So I know we eventually have to make that argument, but I'm thinking we can still make the case for the core claims of the Christian faith using only the minimal facts. But we should be arguing for the reliability of the Gospels and Acts, and of course the Pauline authorship of those other 6 or 7 epistles.
I mean, to be honest, this entire thing just seems like, and I obviously I did a bit of digging into this. The whole thing just seems to be basically a bunch of people who are regurgitating the Enlightenment epistemologies over and over again and aggressively insisting that miracles can't happen, contrary to repeated references not only in the scriptures but in pagan authors and in other Jewish histories, and pretty much I would say like almost I think at least almost all histories prior to David Hume.
Well, to be fair, we're a lot smarter right now, unlike all those other people.
Yeah.
I would love to bring up like
They didn't have iPhones.
There we go. Miracles can happen.
I think one of the most glaringly obvious, like I guess you could say historically documented miracles, if you want to say it, other than the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ, would be the attempt to rebuild the temple by Julian the Apostate. And this is one of the most fascinating stories I learned about a year ago. And every time I can stumble upon a new source for it, it's fascinating because it is essentially documented by both pagan and Christian sources that the Emperor Julian wanted to disprove Christianity. And he was aware that, Jesus promised that, the temple would be destroyed and Christianity would replace that temple. Or he would be the third temple or something like that. And so Julian read that and thought, well, if I want to disprove Christianity, I should rebuild the Jewish temple because that will prove that his prophecies were wrong and thus Jesus isn't true. And so he essentially went to the ruins of the second temple and started rebuilding the Jewish temple with a bunch of workers. And all of a sudden, documented by both pagan and Christian sources, fire erupted, not just like a house fire, like a fireball erupted and killed everyone in a consuming fire of divine proportions. Now, of course, the Christian sources will add some flair to that and say crosses appeared in the sky, and I kind of dismiss that. But even from a secular perspective, this is remarkable that a fireball would consume the entire Temple Mount. We've all been seeing the Temple Mount recently in the news. That is a huge fireball. What is going on? Why is this ignored? This is a divine intervention very clearly to ensure the continuation of Christ's promise. This is why I always tell a lot of American theologians, stop propagating this idea of a third temple. It will never be built. Christ has promised it will never be built because he is the third temple. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that. It looks like you've been trying to say something. I'll shut up.
Is my mic going? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, you've got to remember, though, that these are also the same sort of, Enlightenment inheritors who follow from Gibbon, who, I might be lacking information on Gibbon here when I say this, but it seems as if he discredits Eusebius as a historian, because in one of his works on the Gospels, on the Gospel of Jesus, I can't remember the exact title, he talks about the emotions that God feels, and he says they're analogous, right? And from this, Edward Gibbon claims that Eusebius is a liar and therefore his history isn't reliable. Now, there might be other things to that, but you've got to remember that, it wouldn't surprise me if he did actually hold that, and I have seen the extent of Gibbon's arguments, right? He was in the time that did that. But you've got to remember what they're inheriting from. They'd probably just laugh at something like that. It's like, for example, right, another miracle, the apparitions at Fatima, the miracle of the sun that 75,000 people have seen. I recall seeing one of these professional miracle debunkers, who's one of these PhDs in something or other, claiming that 75,000 people just stared at the sun. And they went into mass hysteria because they'd been staring at the sun expecting something to happen, right? You've got to remember that this is the sort of level of things we're dealing with. We have people who claim that, say, the stigmata of Padre Pio, the ones that lasted for 50 years and didn't develop any infections and didn't leave any scar tissue when he died, these were caused by him repeatedly boring holes in his hands and filling them with nitric acid. You've got to remember the sorts of people that we're dealing with here. They're people who would rather come up with something that doesn't make sense than accept a miracle, many of them.
Yeah, or one of my favorites, saying that Saint Maroon, the miracles of Saint Maroon are caused by, self-deception or just natural causes, despite the fact that these are Muslims who attribute the healings to a Catholic saint. But just to point out a few things, usually this attack on miracles is based on flawed reasoning, and so if you accept an evidential epistemology, one that bases your beliefs on evidence, yes, miracles are very unlikely to happen. They have a very low, what's called prior probability. But just because something has a low prior probability doesn't mean it can't be overcome with sufficient evidence. So, for example, there's a very low probability that I'm going to win the lottery tomorrow if I buy a ticket. Does that mean it won't happen? Most likely it won't, in terms of just sheer odds. But if I was to win the lottery and you guys would doubt me, I'd say, okay, fair enough. There's a very low probability. Here's a ticket. It might even be the case that I might forge it for some reason, maybe because I have a history as a con artist. Well, if the whole ticket checks out as being legitimate, even though there's a low prior, like just the legitimacy of that ticket alone and the verification that the numbers came through, that should be enough to overturn it. Likewise, yeah, there's a very low probability that Jesus rose from the dead because miracles are very hard to come by and very unlikely. They have a very low prior. But if you see somebody die on a cross and the next day that body isn't in the tomb, or that body isn't anywhere present, and a guy who conspicuously looks so much like the guy who was crucified comes up and he is able to teach you, recount stories, cause people to die afterwards, I think that should be counteracting. On top of that, you don't even need like an evidentialist epistemology. There are philosophers like Alvin Plantinga who actually develop an epistemology which is reliable as to nature. So if you have what's called like a sensus divinitatis, like a sense of the divine, that God allows you by grace to apprehend true miracles being communicated to you, you don't even need to like base it on evidence itself. It could just be warranted in its own right. So there's obviously going to be like this very skeptical evidential position that even on its own basis might be overcome. I don't even think you need to accept their epistemological framework for it.
Yeah, I'd rather believe that we came from rock soup, evolved from monkeys, and then the purpose of life is to pursue things that release happy chemicals inside our neurons and avoid things that release bad chemicals inside our neurons. I'd rather have that. So clearly, Padre Pio used nitric acid, and everyone was on, mushrooms during the resurrection, and just, mixed fabrics, shellfish, whatever.
It's kind of crazy how much of a long story they have to develop to like cancel it out. Like, despite us having like rare to no mention of mushrooms in that region at this time for religion, oh yeah, they were all mushrooms. They have to just invent this fiction to justify their beliefs.
Cringe walker. I said mixed fabrics and shellfish. There's no more.
I remember someone like making a really weird claim, like Ezekiel when he eats poo in his prophecy to represent the sort of I think it's the degradation that Israel face. I actually heard somebody claim he was eating the poo because of the psilocybin mushrooms growing on the poo.
It's just it's such a cope for because we had this like big
Is it okay if I had something?
Yeah.
Yeah, you probably saw I just went down to the floor below me just to get some books. I've got these books by Craig Keener. I think everyone knows who that is. He's a scholar of the New Testament. He's a Protestant, very conservative scholar. He's not anti-Catholic, so that's good. But he wrote these two books on miracles, a 2-volume work. And it because he thought it started as like an appendix in a book, and then it became more and more and more and more. And he basically goes through a defense of miracles. I've not finished them, which I probably should. I paid a lot for these books, but so I just wondered, has anyone ever read these? Because I think it's pretty good evidence based on what we've talked about, and I've checked references in here too that miracles do happen.
Well, computing the soul, weren't you going to do a video on miracles that you never got around to?
I was considering it, yeah, because I went through the Stanford page, one of the Stanford pages on plato.stanford.edu, right? And I was looking at the arguments from Hume, which I frankly found laughable. And I saw Spinoza's arguments, which I thought were more interesting. And really, I just wanted to kind of whack people over the head with the like philosophical arguments for them, because, and also the historical arguments, the blatantly the blatant miracles that have happened throughout history, right? Because really, this incredulity isn't really based on anybody thinking. It's just like, lol, ancient people stupid a lot of the time. And when it isn't, it's because of metaphysical, problems. Like, for example, the argument that Spinoza uses according to that page is essentially saying the laws of physics can't be violated because they're innate and they're just as they are, as opposed to what they actually are is a bunch of observations that we've made and trying to fit it into a mathematical framework. And even more, sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this. One of the even more pressing things about this is that I've heard it said by Mathoma, some of you may be familiar with Mathoma, that at higher levels of physics, you have to rely on more numerical methods anyway, which tells you that it maybe isn't quite as clear as, integrals and differentials for certain things, for the whole of physics. And then the whole regularity and whole, inviolability of natural law starts to really break down. And so you just start seeing them being regulations that we observe.
I want to point out something very interesting about David Hume that I think should be brought out a lot more. It's that he was very inconsistent. On the one hand, this is a guy who tried to show that there is no reasonable basis for induction, and then he goes on to say, based on induction, we should have a very low expectation of miracles. So, try to figure
even
that
more
one.
than that. Even more than that. You've got Hume, who denies causation, and then he denies miracles. It's like, well, you haven't got causation. Doesn't that make everything a miracle?
Yeah, and the thing is, you'll have the same kind of atheists talk about, oh, there's a fourth dimension, your shapes would just appear out of nowhere going into the 3D. I don't know if you guys seen that Carl Sargon video. It's so you're literally talking about things coming out of nothing, and because you have a whole fictional physics behind it, it's real and not miracle. It's contradictory.
Just call God the programmer of the simulation, and then they'll be like, oh yes, that makes so much sense. Wow,
Yeah.
very cool.
That it does. But Alan, I want to just bring you into this. In terms of understanding the martyr claims, so in terms of who was martyred for the Christian church and who we can kind of show was a martyr, who would be some good candidates? Would James, the brother of Christ, be a good example of this, or St. Paul or St. Peter?
Well, I think St. Paul and St. Peter, based on a lot of the studying in the Apostolic Fathers I've done, is probably the best example of martyrs, because I think in First Clement, which is written, it's variously dated. I've heard it dated as early as 70. It may be around 100, maybe at 95, 96. It's early. We'll just say that. He's talking about martyrs, I believe, in chapter 5, and he brings up Peter and Paul. And so, I mean, that's a good example of martyrs, and those have always stuck with the church. There's no, as far as I know, there's no other competing tradition than the martyrdom of Peter and Paul, if anyone wants to comment on that.
I do want to bring up something that a skeptic told me. I have their comments saved. I said, James. So I brought up the fact that James, and was documented that he was martyred for the faith, and it was documented by Josephus.
Yeah. And
the response was, well, how do you know that he just didn't really recant and they just didn't record it? Or how do you know that they'll move the goalposts that way? Or how do you know that he was even given a chance to recant and he just didn't? So they'll go even further and say, uber skeptical that, oh, these martyrships, we don't even know if they can happen like that. Maybe they were just executed and no one even cared whether or not they would recant or repent or anything of the like.
What I would do here is I would ask your friend if he applies that skepticism to any other claims in the ancient world apart from various religions. That's what I would ask. Because keep in mind, these people who may, as this person studied ancient history? Does he know how ancient history works? Does he know that people like Suetonius are like the National Enquirer of the ancient world and stuff like that? Knowing whereas Tacitus is more of a proper historian. Does he know any of that? Does he study ancient history? Or is because he does not want to admit Jesus Christ as Lord, so he brings an infinite amount of skepticism forth?
I'll read the comment. If James wasn't given the chance to recant, then one can't assume that he wouldn't have recanted. And if James is the best example we have, then that says more than I can. Even if all 12 plus Paul had evidence for martyrdom, the thing they have defended makes no sense, so I'm not bothered. And it's that last specific one that's important to emphasize. The main crux they had was the moral argument against the atonement. The idea that how could an innocent person die for the sins of the guilty? Now, of course, I don't know what ethical basis they're using to make that determination. As far as if none at all, I'm willing to bet that. All I know is
so he believes in objective morality. Then
didn't even
He
say.
believes
Didn't
in
even
his own objective morality. That's what.
yeah, well, yeah, his own objective morality.
So, sorry, go ahead.
So basically, in terms of how that argument went, I pointed out, look, kings can die for their country. We could imagine an innocent king dying for a country that went to war for bad reasons before they were even enthroned and dying for them. Why can't Christ die for the church? And then their response is, well, it's just wrong to punish innocent people. Just like asserted. Like there is no basis, or at least no argument was given for a basis that I can interact with. It just seems like a bunch of incredulity.
There is a basis. It's all pride.
So he has a moral philosophical argument against Christianity, and because of that he applies an invincible skepticism to the claims of the early martyrs.
Basically.
Okay. I just wanted to lay that out there so everyone can see how absurd that is.
Now, one other thing to keep in mind, though, you don't need somebody to recant in order for them to want to recant or even just to put that forward. So just to use an example from the English Reformation or Revolution, Thomas Cranmer, he was someone who was willing to say, yeah, I totally give up this Protestant stuff. It was nonsense. Please don't burn me to the stake. What did the Catholic Church do? They were like, yeah, we're going to burn you to the stake anyway. Like they just, and what did Cranmer do afterwards? He said, I renounce my declaration of abandoning Protestantism. Let my hand burn first. Like only after he knew he wouldn't save his life. But that withdrawal was at the very least recorded. There is nothing of the like we would see for James. And you would want to see that sort of thing, especially if you want to punish a dissident legal party. You would want to show that their leaders were dissident, that they really didn't believe what they held, and that sort of thing. And yet we don't really see this. And Josephus isn't somebody who would have skipped over that. He was very hostile to the Christians because he was a Jew. And he would probably want to empathize more with the Roman Empire, who he did have a greater sympathy for, which a lot of other Jews later on decry him for.
Well, I think we should add that it's not only that your friend is throwing skepticism on one person; it's three people. Because keep in mind, Paul is persecuted for his faith long before. Like he could have easily died in Acts chapter 14.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's 14. I could be wrong. Where he gets stoned. I'll have to look that up. But yeah, like I mean, Paul did not have an easy life when he converted. He had a much easier life pre-conversion, but then he came face to face with the truth, and then, well, that kind of rocked his world. So
It was just shrooms, just a lot of shrooms.
well,
It's
of
so
course,
ridiculous.
your friend who's an atheist, John, could just
To be
say,
fair, just to clarify, he's not a friend. He was just some random fedora I found on Twitter.
"Oh, okay."
I just
Yeah.
thought it was important to bring it up because that's the kind of over scrupulosity you find.
Fedora.
Yeah, I wanted to mention it because, like, John, you and I have definitely debated this on the issue of John Fisher once or twice. But it's because, like, you know, for the martyrs of the early church, it doesn't really come from authoritative sources. Yeah, the Romans didn't really, as far as we know, they didn't really keep records of these things. It was mostly just historians who would visit these towns of local killed heroes, and they would record them. So if we're relying on more of an oral tradition for martyrdom, I'd actually place like a pretty reliable source in that, because despite what secularists want to say, oral traditions tend to be pretty dang reliable. You know, like you know.
Well, that's actually something funny in the field of history. Is recently, over the past like couple decades, there has been quite a trend towards saying that oral history is actually very reliable. Now, I don't really trust them. I think they're just doing this for like progressive points because non-white people have oral histories. But
I mean, no, I believe it. I fully believe it, right?
Well, no, I
was
mean, I'm not
reading
even saying that, I'm not even saying the conclusion is wrong, but I'm at least incredibly skeptical of their motive for suddenly deciding this. But
No, it's legit, and I'll explain why. I read a book by a memory expert called Lynn Kelly called Memory Craft, right? And she goes through and she's definitely not on our wing of the political spectrum. I'll put it that way. She goes through all these different memory techniques, and they're extremely effective, right? Like, there's one thing that she describes, which is like this tool used by the Luba people of Western Africa, which name completely goes out of my mind. And basically, they put a bunch of beads on a piece of wood, and they put lots of different beads, and they just associate the entire oral history, genealogies, things like this, back on this piece of wood, right? And it's the same with I don't think Australians use memory aids for this, but they'll associate like thousands of years of history with just memorizing things using things like the method of loci. It's really fascinating. So, I mean, yeah, their motivations might be very cosmopolitan, maybe is a polite way of saying it, but that doesn't change the fact that these are extremely effective traditions.
Yeah, perhaps the most famous example of that is the Aboriginal Australian oral tradition of the coast, which describes islands which are currently under the sea level, which would suggest that they're describing events from well over 10,000 years ago when the sea level was that low. And it's just fascinating to see, like, well, if we have this oral tradition that's something in the range of 12 to 9,000 years old, accurately describing topography rather, why can't we trust the martyrs? Like, that's only a few generations. Pretty sure that's reliable.
I don't know, guys. I have this intuition built around a kid's kindergarten game where you just whisper things in other people's ears. I think that's a lot more reliable.
I love that cope because, like, it's literally a game designed and engineered to like change what you're going to say. You're told to change what you're going to say. It's not the soul-saving belief of your tradition that your parents will beat you if you don't agree with.
Guys, just to share something, I found the verse in Acts 14. It's verse 19. It says, "But the Jews came there from Antioch and Iconium, and having persuaded the people, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. But when the disciples gathered about him, he rose up and entered the city, and on the next day he went on with Barnabas to Derbe." So they thought he was dead, so they're stoning him. Stoning often ends in someone's death, and it got to the point where they thought he was dead, so he probably had a chance to recant his faith. Of course, then these atheists, because they hate the Christian message about Jesus Christ, could just say that, oh, that's a fake story, it was made up. But again, how much skepticism do you want to throw about this? Luke is a genuine historian, and like Acts is shown to be incredibly reliable.
Well, yeah, I mean, they tried that with the Torah, didn't they? And then, like, Kenneth Kitchen and people like that just went, no, lol, this makes perfect sense, considering the time period.
So one question I have to ask is, a lot of the time when we kind of approach the scripture, usually to prove the resurrection, that doesn't really require too much. It doesn't really require us to, like, posit, defend, and prove inerrancy. Rather, we're only really required to just have, at the very least, if we take a minimal facts approach, just Paul's epistles and the 7 we can definitely prove, and maybe like the Gospel of Mark. But one thing actually I do want to bring up is whether or not from those sources we could prove Jesus's divinity, because that's often something that's brought into contention. One gospel that usually doesn't seem to have much of a highlight of Jesus's divinity is the Gospel of Mark. Do you think you could actually show Christ is divine from that gospel?
Yes.
Awesome. So what do you got?
Well, first of all, I want to say you have not been listening to Sam Shamoon's live streams. That's all I'm going to say. But
and I'm going to say this as a response. I'm asking this question as a prompt, not as an indication of my level of grasp at how to do this.
Oh, so you know the answer I'm going to say then.
I'll say this much. I think Luthemplar and I discussed it in our last discussion on the Book of Enoch, so I'm kind of curious if you go there.
What do you think I'm going to say?
The Son of Man coming.
That's the clearest example, but I mean, you have to kind of unpack that too. You can't just say, because, like, of course, like, the whole idea is coming on the clouds of heaven, that only God comes on the clouds of heaven. You can find that in the Old Testament. Of course, the one controversial is the Son of Man, but using the context of everything else, you can interpret that. And then there's the fact that how they reacted to him, they said it was blasphemy. So he's not, by claiming to be the apocalyptic Son of Man, he's not claiming to be the Messiah, because although claiming to be the Messiah was a bold claim and a controversial claim, it's not a blasphemous claim. And then he's like, you've heard the blasphemy. What more do we said? In fact, the best or the most clever argument I heard was against this was from Bart Ehrman. And I think he actually conceded it would prove the divinity, but he just proves it's not historical, because they're like, where does Mark get this story from? And I can't remember what Christian he was dialoguing with, but they said Joseph of Arimathea. And there's more examples of the divinity of Christ in Mark. That's the most obvious one, but there's more. There's Mark 2:5-10. There's Christ saying he's greater than God's temple. Who's greater than God's temple but God himself, obviously. And in Mark 1:1, although Mark 1:1 is not the words of Christ, or is it Mark 1:2? But yeah, there's a whole argument with. Hold on. Yeah, Mark 1, 2, and 3. But there's a whole argument there. Like, it'll take a while for me to unpack. But I recommend watching Sam Shamoon on that. But no, there is a good and there's another one. I think it's Mark 6. I couldn't find it offhand, but if you gave me time, I'd find it. Mark 6. I want to say Mark 6:23, and I heard this in a. Okay, it's not that one, but no, it's there's certainly references to the deity of Christ in Mark. It may not be as apparent as John 1:1-18. Like, that is very obvious pre-existence, equality with God before time began. But no, there's a lot of good stuff in Mark. And I think what you'll get, I think what the skeptics will say is that, oh, they elevated him to God after they believed he had ascended into heaven or something like that. Because I know they'll throw all sorts of things. They're like, oh, but was he pre-existent? And I think if you want pre-existent, although it's not in Mark, it's in Matthew and Luke, where he's in chapter 23 of Matthew, where he's talking about Israel. It's like, long have I waited to gather, like he's talking about like prophecy in the history of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And he's talking about like hundreds of years, but Christ was only 30 years old at the time. So there's other evidence like that, but there's certainly proof in Mark and certainly proof elsewhere in the Synoptics and elsewhere in the New Testament as well. But that is not as much a concern when debating an atheist. You'll probably more have to do that when debating with a Muslim who uses all these atheistic arguments, by the way, inconsistently.
All right, so another one is the virgin birth. Now, the virgin birth is obviously something you could demonstrate if you just take Luke and Matthew at their word. However, Paul himself does not, to my knowledge, reference a virgin birth. He even says that Jesus is the seed of David. How would we combat that sort of argument? By saying, Paul's the earliest, he doesn't mention a virgin birth. You think it was important he would have mentioned it?
Now, you don't have to debate this with a Muslim because they'll grant you the virgin birth, no question. But I'm going to get back to Romans 1:3. And that's the one you said, where he's like, oh, he's the seed of David. He is the seed of David. That's true. But keep in mind, he had two natures, a human nature and a divine nature. He gets the seed from the human nature. He gets the divine from being the son of God. But read what that verse that you quoted says carefully. It says, the gospel concerning his son, who was descended from David according to the flesh. He adds that caveat in there. So if they just wanted to say, if he's a normal, he had a normal birth, they'll just say, yeah, he's descended from David, but he's descended according to the flesh, because obviously he had a human nature and a divine nature. So, I mean, I think now he's not outright saying it here, but I do believe he's implying it.
I see. All right, that's a fair enough point. Why doesn't Paul just come out and say he was born of a virgin? Why the matter of implication? Is that something we should just push back by saying, well, maybe it was just already always assumed by everyone in the community, so there would be no point in Paul rehashing it? Or would a better approach be to say, well, sometimes you just don't get everything you want to prove in every place. Doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Well, what I would say about that is, one, I'm going to repeat what I said. I think he hints at it. But why doesn't he say it? Christ was born of a virgin. Because first of all, the answer for that is to go ask Paul. But Paul's been dead for over 1900 years, so we can't ask Paul. I make the same thing about Saint Ignatius, how he does not mention the Bishop of Rome when he writes to the Church of Rome. How come he doesn't? Well, we have to ask Ignatius. Oh wait, he's dead for. So, but now I don't know. The most we can do is speculate. Of course, people like Bart Ehrman would say, "Well, it hadn't been invented yet." Ha ha ha. But I think a more sober-minded explanation is that the reason about the virgin birth, although it's important, it's not the center of the Christian message. He talks about important things. He talks about baptism. He talks about the Eucharist. He talks about saving faith, how we're saved by the grace of God, how he talks about the law, commandments as Christians we need to follow. As important as the virgin birth is, it's not as important as all that stuff. So That's what I'm going to say. It's not the most important thing out there. It's important, but it's not in terms of practical application. Like a book that I read every day, you guys have heard of it. It's called Demontation of Christ by Thomas Kempis. And that book was written in 1420. It's, I think apart from the Bible, it's the most distributed book in the history of the world because of its practical application. And that book isn't like virgin birth. No, it's talking about how to live a holy life. And of course, he may have assumed that they knew it, and like I don't know. We can only speculate. You could have a radical skeptic speculation by Bart Ehrman, or you could have the speculation I just had. And I think he pretty strongly hints at it in Romans 1:3.
I think that's fair. And you are right. It isn't really at the center of the Christian message. The center is Christ died and was resurrected, and that is the central facet of all of it. So one,
I actually had so another question.
oh, go for it.
Yeah. So okay. So a bit earlier we were talking a lot about martyrdom and how this how the early martyrdom accounts could possibly be a bit of evidence for Christianity. But say, what about Islam? Didn't Islam have a lot of martyrs? Doesn't that prove Islam true by the same token?
Who?
Okay. I'm just echoing a debate I had with an atheist recently. Basically, his argument was, what was all the people that died in the early battles in Islam count as martyrs?
I mean,
because the only reason they were fighting against Mecca, was because they believed in their faith, and they were risking their life just as much as James or Peter was.
Like the Battle of Uhud, the Battle of Badr. Okay, yeah, I can see that. Yeah, well, let's be honest. Every faith has martyrs, and they died for the belief that Muhammad was a prophet. I mean, I'm not going to deny those people died believing Muhammad was a prophet. That's true. I mean, there's martyrs for every faith out there. Keep in mind, I didn't bring up martyrs as a core of my evidence. A lot of people like to. It's good evidence, but I don't think it's as good as some other. Now keep in mind, if you're a Muslim sitting in Mecca or Medina in the 620s following Muhammad, he just goes into a fit, then comes out with a verse of the Quran. So, and you have to believe that came from Allah, right? And if you're James or Peter, maybe not Paul, but James or Peter, who saw the death and resurrection of Christ, they're not only dying for their faith, but they're dying for an event. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, but what with what are the Muslim arguments against like Christ's resurrection? Because they say he's like a prophet, but that he wasn't God, right? So what did they say? What someone said earlier about how he just came off the cross or something and escaped?
Well, there's the Muslim apologist you'll meet today. There's this one verse in the Quran that says they did not kill him, they didn't crucify him, but it was made to appear to them, and those who differ are follow only assumption. I'm paraphrasing here, but that's in the Quran. I've read the Quran 4 times. What you see there, they see, because the one thing all historians of Jesus believe in is his crucifixion under Roman authorities. They all believe in that. That's the one fact they'll all agree on. Someone like Bart Ehrman will deny the virgin birth, deny Jesus said pretty much everything in the gospel, save a few words. The resurrection's fake. They just hallucinated. Shrooms again. We're talking a lot about shrooms. But he'll say that he died on a Roman cross. That's the one thing all the only ones who don't believe in that are the ultra skeptics who don't believe he existed. It's kind of hard to crucify someone who didn't exist, right? So the Muslims basically essentially do the same fallacy. They'll imply an invincible, an impossible standard to this event. And if you take a look at all of the Muslim apologists who have debated this issue, I'm thinking of four in particular. One is Shabir Ali, one is Adnan Rashid, the other one is Zakir Hussain, and the other one is Ijaz Ahmed, who's been exposed as a racist doxer. Now, so those four, they all have completely different arguments against the crucifixion of Christ, because they don't know what to do with it. And they know that all those other arguments are junk. That they all know each other's arguments are junk. That's why they don't use them. Like Shabir Ali thinks that Christ was on the cross. Like he was actually put on the cross, but he was taken off the cross. They thought he was dead, but he was actually alive and then assumed from the tomb. He survives a Roman crucifixion, receives no medical attention, and he's assumed it's ridiculous. Then Adnan Rashid tries to just throw out a bunch of contradictions. And now those supposed contradictions can be reconciled, but still people like Bart Ehrman, who believe the Gospels contradict each other on everything, he still agrees with that. So that doesn't work. There's contradictions on the death of a lot of people in the ancient world, including people in the medieval and modern world. Like how did for example, I was talking about the fall of Constantinople. How Giovanni Giustiniani Longo die? Did he get an arrow in the leg? Did he get it in the chest? Did he get hit by a cannonball? Did he die on the boat fleeing, or did he die in Galata? But no one doubts that he died because of wounds sustained in that battle. The third one is Zakir Hussain, whose arguments seemed clever until you examined them. James White didn't know what to do with them at the time. That like he prayed in the garden to be saved from death. And he didn't pray to be saved from death. He said, if it is possible, save me from death, not my will, but thy will. And of course, if you read Acts 2:22, that was the God's plan from all eternity. And he misquoted a bunch of sources that you can't, of course, you can't check during the debate, but you can check after, and we've checked them all, and they're mostly out of context. Now, and then you had Ijaz Ahmed, and he basically tries to have this sophisticated historical methodological skepticism versus credulity, and he basically tries to throw a whole bunch of stand up in the air. And the person he debated, I don't think did a very good job in the cross-examination. I think they really could have taken him to town on a few things. So they don't know what to do with the crucifixion. Each apologist has his own plan, and they're all equally bad. So they don't know what to do. And their main argument at the end of the day boils down to Muhammad's a prophet and the Quran says it. So basically anything that says to the contrary is unreliable. Of course, to Christians and to everyone else, we would just say, well, that just shows that the Quran is not a reliable historical document.
What? So you read the Quran 4 times?
Yeah.
But I thought you were religious extremists, and super devout religious extremists never are extremely close-minded never learn anything about any other religion because it's dangerous and everything. By the way, I get most of my understanding of the world from reading subreddits.
I have a bit of a question on that though. Islam seems, I guess I'll say unoriginal, because most of the Quran seems derived from Gnostic books like the Book of Judas and stuff like that. With like the whole who is on the cross question, that's directly from the Gnostic argument in the Gospel of Judas. So like, why do they need this whole like crazy angel in the cave story when it's already existing in the world? It's not a new revelation. Like the entire Islamic. Yep.
Can I quickly like interject it and like clarify the first example I think we have of the crucifixion before I go, because it's like 1:15 here and I'm tired. Yeah, I believe it's the Gospel of Basilides, and that was written in the 2nd century, right? So we know from textual criticism that the canonical Gospels and the entire canonical New Testament, as far as I know, were written before the Gnostic Gospels. So any kind of Islam-style story where he wasn't really crucified doesn't come about until, well, you know, at least 70 years after Jesus' crucifixion.
Yeah.
So it doesn't really bode well. Anyway, I'm gonna go now. So thanks for having me on, Settler.
Yeah, no problem. Do you want to shill anything before you go?
My channel. If you guys want to subscribe to that, it's in the description. Yeah, I'm gonna go eat and then sleep. So I'll see you guys. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah.
All right, nice meeting you, computing, and God bless.
God bless.
Thank you. God bless you all.
Just to like finish the point I was making though, like a lot of the Quranic claims of like new revelation aren't new nor original. They're seemingly plagiarized from Gnostic texts. So why do we even debate with Muslims about their book when their book is not even fulfilling the claim that's new, like a final revelation? It's not.
What is the well? Is it possible I could say something about what computing said?
Yeah, go ahead. I can wait.
He mentioned that this comes from Basilides, and that's true. He did deny the crucifixion because he said Jesus didn't have a visible body, a physical body. You can't crucify a spirit, right? So, and this is something else Zakir Hussain brought up in his debate on the whole issue, and of course, at the time, James White debating him didn't know. But if you check out what Basilides believed in, you can find out in Saint Irenaeus's book Against Heresies, and it is whack. It's nothing even remotely close to Christianity or Islam or Judaism. It's not just Gnosticism; it's highly messed up Gnosticism. Like, go look. I don't know the reference offhand. I think I have an article about it on my website, allanruhl.com. But, oh, man, it is messed up. So if you want to base your faith on what that whack job believed, be my guest.
Just to mention one more thing. So I have very little knowledge on Islam. It's not a religion I've delved too deeply into. I recently on my podcast had a Muslim guest come on, and we discussed our different interpretive methods for the Quran and the Bible respectively. But I'll say one thing. The idea that skeptics can bring up other religions is laughable. I don't reject Islam because I think their miracle claims are false. For all I know, they could be all true. The question isn't whether or not we accept those miracle claims. It's Jesus himself performed miracles. He didn't convert all the pagans because they believed he was just one power among many. There's a difference between making him your sole God and authority over all others and an exclusion of all others, and accepting him as just like one power among many. With Christ, he gives a moral code and compass to live by in addition to those miracle claims. Those miracle claims could help shore everything up, but it's that virtue and moral value that he gives. When it comes to Islam, we don't judge Islam and its beliefs based upon their miracle claims or the veracity of it, although you can. But rather, the question is, which religion gives you a better and more fitting moral code and standard? Whether or not, I don't really care too much about what miracles were done in the name of Muhammad. demons can perform magic tricks. Angels can do so. Do so as well. The question is whether or not they have a moral code and belief that is worth following. I think that's where the discussion between Christians and Muslims should lie. It's less on the veracity of the historical claims. So I think that the skeptic is really just shooting themselves in the foot.
Well, I mean, if I could just disagree with a slight bit of that.
Go for it.
You said we could evaluate, like the question is evaluating the moral codes. I actually disagree. I think, is Muhammad a prophet or not? I mean, if Muhammad's a prophet, we all got to be Muslim, right? Let's face it, that's a claim out there. I mean, if he's a prophet of God or Allah or who knows, that's a true question. So, I mean, they claim that this Johnny come lately came, and basically the Jews and the Christians have both gone astray, although they do have some truth left. Therefore, God has come to set the record straight with Muhammad and the Quran. So yeah, I think that's the ultimate question. Because, let's face it, if Muhammad's a true prophet, the stuff he taught, his morals are correct. Like, if you want to bring up the whole argument from morals, I mean, it's true. Muhammad had sex with a 9-year-old, and that is, that was a standard at the time. So, it's bad, but that was the standard at the time in Arabia.
What?
Yeah, that's in their hadiths. He had sex with a 9-year-old girl. Now, but if if he's a prophet, that we can't argue with that. If Muhammad said it's good and moral, it's good and moral.
Sorry.
So just to push back a little, there's something to be said about believing in moral codes that are counterintuitive. Like, sometimes the moral thing to do does strike against your intuitions. Lying is wrong, and arguably you have an obligation to tell the truth, or at the very least not to lie to someone who is an axe murderer who comes to your door and is looking for your victim who's hiding out. There's been plenty of ink spilled on that question. But in terms of my understanding of Christianity, one of the things that I find very convincing about the Christian faith is it provides an answer to certain moral issues. Like John E. Hare calls it the issue of the moral gap. We have a certain innate demand and obligation to always follow the moral law and be perfect, and yet everyone falls short of it. One thing that is really good about Christianity is the atonement provides a way of kind of bridging that moral gap, and it actually does answer a lot of those questions, especially in light of the fact that we all fall short of what God really requests of us. And I think if that's one of the reasons you have a positive belief in Christianity and other religions really can't meet that requirement, then at the very least you have good evidence on the basis of ethics for why Christianity is true, where other religions like Islam and Judaism might fall short. So it's not necessarily just a matter of whether or not a particular religion has counterintuitive moral claims. It's whether or not they actually provide the requisites for a consistent ethical system. That's more along the lines of what I'm trying to get at.
And then when the Jews and the Christians and the Muslims went a bit of astray, we got Joseph Smith with the Mormons to repair everything.
Yeah, the only thing I have to say is that I think it's the Hadith says that Muhammad waited for her to have her first period, but that's still going to be really too young.
Nope, it didn't wait for it.
Yeah. I don't know for sure. By all means, correct me. I don't know. Sure.
Read the Quran. It says in the Hadith that he engaged to her at 6 and consummated when she was 9. Now, if you read the Quran, Surah 65, verses 3 and 4, it talks about people who have about marrying and divorcing people who are prepubescent, and who still menstruate, like the people who have not menstruated yet, the people that are menstruating, and the people who have ceased menstruating, menopause. And the people that have not menstruated yet is that's by definition prepubescent. And don't listen to my opinion on Surah 65, verse 3 and 4. Check their commentaries. Check their best Muslim commentaries.
That's perhaps another thing to bring up with, like, Bible versus Islam. I've been told, and I'm not completely sure, but I lean on believing it, that the Hadiths as well as the Quran, it's not as like singular in its origin as people claim, that there's like 4 different dialects of Arabic that it comes from, and that some of them disagree with it. And of course, the Hadiths themselves are interpreting things and adding things to those things that the Quran doesn't even say. It's an academic mess, quite frankly, and highly disorganized to compare to the Bible.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Islam is just for me one of those things I don't think I'm equipped to speak about at this moment. It's probably one of those ones I'm going to need to develop my knowledge on.
Well, the Quran, just based on how it's compiled, it's very, very out of order. I mean, if you take a look in the Old Testament or New Testament, it starts very basic, right? Old Testament, you got the creation, you got the early prophets, you've got Genesis, you got Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, then you got Moses, and then it goes all the way until New Testament. You get Christ, you got the early church, etc. So what happened with the Quran is it's completely out of order. The stories don't begin, they don't end. The first chapter of the Quran is kind of like a prayer. It's kind of like the Islamic equivalent of the Our Father. And then starting with chapter 2 and on, like, just pick it up and try to make heads or tails with it. It's I mean, some stuff's more coherent, but a lot of it is just whacked.
To be fair, it could be the case that the Quran is just something that needs to be interpreted along the lines of traditions and community approved commentaries. So I know that, yeah. So like in my discussion with my Muslim friend Hanif, he actually pointed out that, look, the Quran, we're not Protestants. We don't believe like in sola Quran. Like the Quran is not going to make sense to you unless it's interpreted and properly understood through a framework of tradition. We actually even went to
Based?
I'm sorry?
Based?
Based, yes.
They're not Protestants. That's something.
They actually consider like the Quran only position be downright heretical, and justifiably so. I think that sola scriptura for any religion doesn't really make sense.
Yeah, I mean, all the like Quran only Muslims I've met are always like Western feminists.
And so it begins. The inevitable victory of liberalism will continue.
Protestant Islam, literally left wing, just like.
In fact, one of the things him and I agree on is the truth of divine simplicity. He actually pointed out that, look, when we read things like God is angry in the Quran, we don't believe that God literally has the human emotion of anger. He says he follows Al-Ghazali in saying, no, the anger is just a manifestation of punishment. We attribute that to anger because we look at the effect and we read back into God the cause. So that's actually something that Catholics do often. So the structure of the Quran, I think, is probably just one of those things that you'd have to understand it through a commentary. And it might come into a little bit of a clash with the Quran is perfect and this, and I dare you to create another one like it. But I think in terms of charity, the reason why the Quran is probably the way it is just comes down to some kind of like traditional assessment or some kind of commentary assessment.
So who are you closer in belief to, that Muslim friend or Mormons?
The Muslim, like at least the Muslims believe in a god. Mormons just believe in superheroes.
Whoa.
Excuse me, not superheroes, aliens.
Fair enough. As much as critical as
Mormonism is the precursor to Scientology.
basically.
Yes.
In fact, I think I think I have more in common with Muslims than I do with post-Enlightenment liberals here in North America. Like,
that's literally true.
One thing that Hanif actually said was, I can't believe there's a civilization where they don't want to preserve their traditions and they don't punish people for not wanting to preserve their traditions. And I couldn't really disagree with him on that one. Liberalism is kind of a suicide in that.
Crazy what progressivism can do to a civilization. But yeah, no, that makes sense. And at least they're modest too. Goodness.
Well, if you take a look at Reformed Judaism, the most liberal, I guess there's some other more liberal sects, but they're small in number. But the Reformed Jews is a proof that religion is suicide. There's no Reformed Jews who had Reformed Jewish grandparents. Like all the Reformed Jews had Orthodox Jewish grandparents, and their grandchildren are going to be a Gentile or identify as Gentile. They might have a mom's mom Jewish, but they're going to be fully Gentile. Because liberalism is suicide. And you talked about the post-Enlightenment West. A lot of Muslims, including intellectuals and academics, and just your average Muslim on the street, have adopted that post-Enlightenment mentality. I mean, as a Catholic in the West, we're certainly have that problem as well. However, I think we're more equipped to deal with it because we've had that for 250 years, whereas the Muslim is getting their first taste of it when they move here. And if you want to know how it affects the Muslims, go talk with a Muslim who's just moved here from a Muslim country, then talk to that same Muslim again in 5 years.
Deracinated immediately.
Yeah.
I was going to bring up, I'm not sure if you guys remember, but there's a story where in the UK, they want to teach the whole, gender, non-binary stuff. And it actually took Muslims standing up and say, yeah, this is against our faith. We won't tolerate it. And they took it to court. And I'm like, well, I wish we stood up for that, but apparently we actually have to. It appears nobody is willing to stand up to just stand up for that old common sense belief.
I secretly fund Muslim special interest groups that lobby for based anti-progressive stuff.
Do you guys know a Muslim named Daniel Hakikachu?
Yes.
Yeah, he is my favorite Muslim, hands down. Like, that guy he's always complaining about liberal Muslims in the West.
There's a show that I've been on recently, the EA show, and the guy who runs it, his name is Khalil, but he used to go by Justin. He went from atheism to Islam, and funny enough, he wants to be called Khalil, and all his atheist friends are like, no, you're Justin to us. You're still Justin. Well, not all of them, but many of them are. And I'm like, you know what? If he wanted to go by Justine, no one would have this problem. Just saying.
I wanted to just bring up one final note. So, like, again, emphasizing the reliability of Christianity versus, like, we've gone through Islam and a lot of other religions, but one of the big things about, like, I think why Christianity is more reliable than Judaism is the fact that, like, they were basically speaking Greek for most of their history since the destruction of the temple and even before. There's this idea that, like, modern Judaism, it has this, like, oh, they have the religion, so they never had to go through translations like Christianity, or they had to, like, they were kept a single social unit and everything. But in fact, this is a later development in the Middle Ages. Most of the time they were speaking Greek, and their oldest texts were Greek. It wasn't until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls that we had a pretty reliable Hebrew source for their texts, which is something important to remember. And even the spoken language of today's Hebrew is a reconstruction that occurred during the 1800s and such. During the nationalism era, there was a reconstruction of Judaism to replace the Greek and Yiddish that they were speaking. And so what we have today as Hebrew is a bit of a fictional language, is vowels that didn't exist in ancient Hebrew. It has words that have been reconstructed from assumed sources. It's not a reliable origin myth for that religion, and in many ways it is something that kind of like grew out of a medieval myth, and it's not exactly clear if they are the descendants of the Jews that went into exile, but more maybe something that was proto-Gnostic that developed into an entity that we today call Judaism. There's not a clear and reliable connection between the Judaism we see today, and by this I mean, like, the European branches of Judaism. The Levantine branches of Judaism, the Shafaric Jews, would be more reliable of a source. But for Ashkenazi and other European Jews, it's largely reconstructed from assumed language and bits and pieces of culture. And again, like, most of them did not have Hebrew origins for their beliefs. In many ways, they're traditions of the rabbis that is that the Talmud, if I remember correctly, the word for it. The Talmud is largely a critique on the Old Testament, that you'll find some critiques that are as powerful as some secular beliefs. And so you kind of have to, I guess in many ways, we as modern people assume, oh, they call themselves Jews and they're living in Israel, they must be connected to the people that used to live there that called themselves Jews and called their nation Israel. But this is not really true. This is a reconstructed myth in the modern era. For most of the Middle Ages, there were Gnostic cults that slowly developed into something we call Judaism today, that had very strange origins, and like what Kabbalah or something was it called, like very Gnostic origins for what we today call modern Judaism. It doesn't seem to have a large connection to its classical roots, if there even is the same group that went to the classical roots. The modern Judaism of today might be derived from a offshoot of Judaism from the Alexander era that was not related to the Judaism we see in the New Testament that Jesus was speaking to. That group of people might have simply gone extinct with the exile.
Well, you really are. We really are doing the debunk all the. But what about all the other religions thing? What about Buddhism?
Come on, what's next?
Buddhism.
Yeah, I mean, on honestly, Luthemplar, everything you said there sounds kind of ridiculous, so I'm pretty sure it's not true. Also, the Bible explicitly says that the conversion of the Jews is a sign of the end time, so there has to be some Jews somewhere.
Yeah, Shafaric.
Okay. But yeah, so I'm going to assume what you said is not true, but very exciting conspiracy theories as always from Luthemplar.
But Buddha sounds cool.
I was a practicing Buddhist for gone.
Oh well, I was just gonna say, getting back to something John said. John said that Mormons don't believe in God; they believe in superheroes. And John, tell them what you said about Islam.
Let's see. What?
Well, we're debating if it's Abrahamic or not.
Oh, I said something. I forget. It was probably funny knowing me.
It's Abrahamic fan fiction.
Okay, it's Abrahamic.
But and that's the same thing I would say. We're talking about Jews. That's the same thing I would say about Kabbalah. Like, there's nothing Abrahamic about Kabbalah. It's just a bunch of Gnostic a load of crap. Let's be honest.
Yes.
So my friend who's a rabbi, Gav, he actually told me that within Judaism, there's like two strands. There are the rationalists and there are the mystics. Like the mystics go for the Kabbalah stuff. The rationalists are like, what the hell are you talking about? You're studying a document that, unless you're 35 years old, because that's the minimum you have to be to read the Sephirot or whatever that Zorah, that you go crazy. Yeah, this is probably not the way we should guide our faith. So yeah, I kind of more sympathize with that whole rationalist approach. But something else I want to touch on. Ultimately, even Judaism has to be considered to be a sort of Abrahamic fan fiction, because it places Abraham as being noble and his descendants based on their lineage, where Scripture says no, it's based on the circumcision of your heart, not on the circumcision of your body. And that's what Christianity does continue with. So Muslims get it wrong, but to be fair, so did Judaism, in terms of how it veered off as well. Doesn't mean we can't sympathize with them to some extent and find commonalities, but truth is truth, and Christianity always has to be placed there.
Okay, but Buddhism is similar. It has a very strong ascetic streak where you do have to kind of reject the world. I understand that it goes farther, and Christianity isn't purely ascetic, but there's some similarities there. Maybe all religions are the same or something.
Well, Buddhism is atheistic, or at the very least, the gods that they posit, even they need to follow the path of the Buddha. So I wouldn't put it in the same camp. I'd say that Christianity, Islam, Judaism, a few other groups that are in that family, at the very least, they recognize one creator who is God and Lord over all the universe. And you could say the same thing about even certain heathens like Aristotle and Plato. They recognize that there is at least a prime mover or a God. And in light of that, they follow the natural law and know that it starts with the creator. Where they fail is in noting that you need grace and the law of Christ and God's revelation. That's what Christianity completes.
I see in the text someone's joking that Zoroastrianism is a Christian sect. This might be a fun topic to discuss, given the present.
Okay, whoa, guys, this has gone on for way too long. I'm
okay.
So tired. Yeah, we're shutting this down. Okay.
Wait, one more thing. Is it okay with you? One more thing.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, I recommend everyone get this book, The Case for Jesus by Brant Petrie. It gives a good solid evidence for the scriptures, the Gospels, the Pauline epistles, the early views of Christ, death, resurrection, and deity. And if you read this book and like it, Brant Petrie has a whole host of other amazing books. But on this topic we discussed today, this is the book to read.
Yeah, I agree. I've actually read that book. It's very good. Are there any other on this topic? Are there any other book recommendations you or anyone else would like to make?
I might have one if I can find it. It was. Do you know the author Al? Do you know the author of Gonzalez? His history of the early church.
Yeah, I've heard of him. I've not read his books.
Yeah, I don't know his first name, but Gonzalez's the Story of Christianity. I just found it in my library. So The Story of Christianity by Justo Gonzalez. I've really enjoyed this book. I think it's more designed to be read by curious progressives, or how should we say, it's designed for open-minded progressives. I really enjoyed it. I'm not
Those
finished.
Exist?
Yeah, they're gonna have to pretty soon. It's a really enjoyable book. It opens the story with a lot of the apostolic fathers, and it goes into a great deal of the age and the class of the early church. And this is something that progressives love to babble about, but it makes a point that a large amount of the early church was women and young people who were like eager to get into something alternative than the dying Roman cults that were murdering and genociding and worshiping a rapey god like Zeus.
Diverse and inclusive new religion.
Yeah, I want to recommend it. It's a pretty good book. Again, just Gonzalez's The Story of Christianity. It's a two-parter. I'm reading the first part. I've enjoyed it. I'm just gonna recommend it.
One I would recommend, and I know Al's probably going to roll his eyes a little, but the Knox Bible, believe it or not, actually does have a pretty good commentary, and a lot of it does aim a certain apologetic at some criticisms. So there's one chapter which speaks of Joseph being sold off to Ishmaelites or Hittites. And a lot of critical scholars like to use that as pointing out, oh, look, it's just a mishmash of two stories, because the Ishmaelites are coming in at one point and then the Hittites are coming in at another point. And Knox's response is just to say, yeah, one is geographical and the other is terms of lineage. It's just using the same term interchangeably. And I thought that was a pretty swell answer. And Knox does provide those little apologetical tidbits. Another one that I really liked is in terms of the census, like when Luke is referencing it in terms of Christ's birth. And a lot of people like to point out, well, this is inconsistent with what we know of history. Knox's point was to say, actually, you could translate this as being harmonious. And that's what Knox does with that specific chapter and verse. So I'd suggest Knox. He does try to address all those little issues, and he does so in a very good way. Another book recommendation I would suggest is Mark Allan Powell, and Introducing the New Testament, a historical, literary, and theological survey. It gives you a pretty good insight into what the critical scholars are saying, the people that are come into the text very skeptical. So he is actually someone who gives a bit of an apologetic for the diverse understanding of the authorship. And if you want to approach it from that point and want to see what that side says, I'd suggest that book. So that would be, again, Introducing the New Testament, a historical, literary, and theological survey by Mark Allan Powell.
Okay, these guys have recommended all these books. I want to give something different, something for the illiterate, something that we can all do without buying the book. And I would say for all of you out there, you can do this at any point in time, any part of the day. So it's very easy. Just meditate on the Passion of Christ. It's a very important part of mental prayer that everybody has to do. So you just have to meditate on one of the aspects of it: the scourging, the mocking, the spitting, the crown of thorns, the crucifixion itself. Just meditate on one of those things. And I hope that helps.
That sounds like the rosary.
Pray the rosary every day. I haven't been doing that recently. So any other books? Anyone? I'll take that as a no.
I think it was you, Settler, who brought up Kenneth Kitchen, but that's Old Testament. So if you're interested in debunking a lot of the tired criticism of the whole Old Testament, that's where to go. But that's his book's pretty expensive, whereas this is just it's not that. It's an easy buy, but that's what you got to do if you have to get the Old Testament. But yeah, so no, I don't have anything else for books.
Okay. Well, yeah. So, okay, Schilling, right? I always mean to do this at like the beginning of the stream to have everyone introduce their channels, because I know no one's watching by this point. But I forgot, so I guess that means you guys aren't going to get many subs from this today. So, but you still, everyone, chill your channel.
Someone go first.
All right. My name is John Fisher 2.0. My name is John Fisher 2.0. Check me out over at Original Win Productions. I am on YouTube, and of course, if you want to follow me on Twitter, you could go and find me at John Fisher 2.0. That is DOT and the number 0.
For me, you can go to my website, allanruhl.com, ALLANRUHL.com. And you can also find me on social media, on Twitter, under the name Allan Ruhl, and YouTube under Allan Ruhl. I go by Al here, but it's Allan, Allan space Ruhl, Ruhl. And thanks for having me on, Settler. And yeah, it's been a blast.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on. And Alan's channel is very good. I have the YouTube channel linked below. Make sure to subscribe. The Luthemplar.
We just did the Foundations podcast earlier today for the Industrial Revolution, in which we observed the start of the decline. Other than that, I do a Substack at luthnite.substack.com. I ramble about stuff. Have a really good one about the advent of how the invention of technology, the invention of television in America was primarily done by Russian refugees of the Russian Empire. Pretty cool little exploration, some deep lore there. I guess John Fisher will be publishing the discussion we did on Enoch soon. It was a really good talk. I really enjoyed that video, so be sure to catch it on his channel. And my YouTube channel is cringe. It's still Cringe Walker, the old name.
Sorry, Luthemplar, you're not getting linked below, because you're a latecomer today. Stream.
No worries.
But you can Google everything he said there if you're interested. And 21st Reaction, I mean, you already kind of blurted out your channel. Do you need to say anything else?
I feel bad, but John Fisher, he was saying it at the same time, so it was weird. But okay, so we're in the 21st century, right? And every now and then, historically, there's a reaction. And so that entire historical development is happening in microcosm of my channel. It's not for the faint of heart. Enter if you dare.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for joining us. Goodbye.
Good night.